I am so grateful to serve a God who is a promise keeper. We live in a world where people don't always keep their word, and they'll promise you things and they'll let you down or they'll fail, but God never fails. And his word is true. And we can trust him, we can depend on him, we can rely on him. And I love God for that. And I'm just so grateful to him. And as you go through your daily routine or whatever it is, just remember that when God talks to you and when he promises you something, hold on to that and don't let go of that for anything. And always understand that no matter what it looks like, when it seems like it's impossible, when it feels like there's just no way for it to work out, remember who God is and the power that he has. He is a wonder working, miracle working God. He is a provider and he is a promise keeper, and he will sustain you, and God is going to always do exactly what he said. As always, it is such a pleasure to have you join me for the Sanctuary Sunday School. And again, I'm always going to say thank you because I'm so grateful for this ministry. It blesses me more than you know, just the process of studying and presenting the lesson and interacting with you. I thank God for that. I'm grateful for you. I want to say thank you again for the donations, and some of you are donating weekly, and thank you because it really does help me. It frees up time for me to continue to do this where I don't have to do other things, because the Word of God and God's people is definitely at the top of my list of priorities. This week's subject is the Son of Promise, and we can find this in the book of Genesis, and we're still talking about Abraham and Sarah. And we've been talking about this whole story for a few weeks now. And again, like I said last week, this has really been blessing me. Because the devil, the enemy, he's a deceiver, and he will try to convince you it ain't gonna work. You know, God is not with you. You don't know what you're doing, and he'll talk to you and he'll tell you that. But that's not true. When God calls you and when God sends you, he's always going to make a way, and everything that he says he's going to do, he's going to do it. And what we see here in this lesson, which what makes it such a good lesson, is that this is the beginning of the fulfillment of the covenant that God made with Abraham. And at this point, Abraham is 100 years old. And just look how long it took God to start the process. Abraham is not even going to live to see the fulfillment of the entire covenant, but we're right here. He is 100 at the start of it. I just want to stop right there because that was a lesson in patience for me. There's a song they sing sometime that says, you can't hurry God, no. You just got to wait. You've got to trust him and give him time no matter how long it takes. He's a God that you can't hurry. He'll be there. Don't you worry. He may not come when you want him, but he's right on time. And I thank God for that. He came, and it says that Sarah conceived a son. It said the Lord came and visited her. You know, I serve a God that will come and he'll see about you. He'll come and visit you. He came and he visited Sarah. And it says, the word says that he did what he had spoken. God did just what he said. And Sarah conceived this son, which was the promise. And as we know, that God had promised to Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, and that his seed would be so great until it would be numbered as more than the stars of the sky, or it would be greater than the number of the grains of sand, and that he would have multitudes, and kings and queens would come from him, and also that through his seed the entire world would be blessed. And this was such a powerful blessing. And we see, as we've seen through all of these lessons we've had the last couple of weeks, Abraham did not falter. He continued to go. At no point did he give up on the promise. He did take things into his own hands a few times, but he did not disobey God. And he stood and he stayed there and he waited until God was able to bless him. And so we see that Sarah had this child in an old age. Now, last week we talked about Abraham, when Abraham told him that it was time that in the next year Sarah would conceive, and it said Abraham laughed. Now we see that when God came to Sarah, Sarah laughed. And it's just good to see the laughter and the joy in this couple after everything that they had gone through. especially back in that day with women. It was kind of different than it is now. When women were kind of valued by their ability to produce a seed and produce offspring. So to be barren back in that day, and even now, there's a certain stigma attached to it, and society will label you a certain way. But for her to go through her life, 90 years being barren, there were women that would no doubt ridiculed her. And we talked about the son, even though our word says here that when Hagar the handmaid bore Ishmael for Abram, it said it mocked Sarah, and just imagine how she felt. And so at this point, she said, "Oh, I'm going to get to laugh. I got the last laugh now because I am going to actually nurse a child in my old age." And how she gave birth and she took care of this son, and God opened her womb and allowed this miraculous birth to happen. And see, sometimes our miracle is in our faith and our patience. I want to say that again. Sometimes your miracle comes as a result of your faith and your patience. When God promises something to you, you cannot let go of that promise. By all natural guidelines or ramifications, Sarah was not supposed to conceive. It's not like she was 30 or 40 or 50, where okay, yeah, there's a possibility. She was all the way past childbearing years, and she was not supposed to conceive. And again, I kind of touched on this last week. Sometimes God does things in a way that edifies people and glorifies him, because it makes people have to stop and take note. And see, sometimes we want things to happen normal. We want things to happen the way everything else happens or everybody else does. Well, God ain't a person. And so God is above any human thought or imagination. So sometimes God does things in a way that we know that it was a miracle and it was nobody but him. So when you're going through that season of waiting and I'm not understanding what's going on and knowing what God told you, but you can't see any signs of it, just think about God could possibly be setting you up for a miracle, because God definitely will not ever set you up to fail. And when God gives you a promise, you cannot be afraid to just step out there. Remember, Abraham left. He left his father's house. He left everything that was familiar to follow God. And God called him out to be the father of this great nation. And this nation is still a great nation to this very day, and how God blessed him and God delivered. And we see this son, and his name was going to be Isaac, and how Sarah was able to laugh and they were able to have joy at God keeping his promise of this son. And this was the son between the man Abram and the woman his wife, the man Abraham and the woman his wife Sarah, husband and wife. This is who God chose, their son Isaac, to fulfill the covenant that he had made with Abraham and keep his promise. So then it says that he also, one thing I love about Abraham is that he was so obedient. And that's a lesson right there that kind of really just popped in my head. Faith and obedience go hand in hand. So if you believe what God says, then you'll do what he says. And that is a lesson. That's a whole lesson right there. So as you read through the book of Genesis and even throughout the Old Testament, you'll see that God is so specific in his instructions and what he tells people to do. And so he told Abraham that Isaac should be circumcised at 8 days old. And that's exactly what Abraham did. And I've been watching this because Abraham's faith is what led him and what guided him. And it is what gave him the strength to be obedient to God and to believe in him. And he did exactly what he said. At that 8th day, he circumcised Isaac just like God told him to do. And throughout this whole process, even if you go flip back through the previous lessons, it would say where God told Abraham to do something, and then the next verse or the next chapter would say where Abraham did exactly what God told him to do. That's how we need to be. If we believe God, we're going to do exactly what he tells us to do, and we are not going to second guess him. And so now we see he did that. And then Sarah, she nursed him just like a mother would nurse a child. And then it says that after the baby was weaned and he got up some size, now Sarah looked back at Hagar and she cast out Hagar. And we know that Hagar is the handmaid who had given birth to Ishmael at Sarah's request. But now Sarah's son was born and she cast out Hagar. And next week's lesson is actually about what happened to Hagar, but God did take care of Ishmael as well. So you got to subscribe, tap the bell, and come back next week to find out the rest of that story. But we see here today we are talking about the promise of God. And I want you to just think about if God has made you a promise. God has made promises to me, and he's been so faithful, and I've learned to trust him. And I've learned that when God promises you something, it doesn't come the way that we think that it should come. So I want you to really think about if God has promised you something, or if you've asked God for something, or if you're trusting God for something, if you're going through something, if you're in the midst of that process, don't let go. Hold on, believe, and most importantly, obey. Don't allow anything to stop you from obeying the word of God, whatever it is, and not just obeying the word of God. There may be something specifically that God told you to do, like this Sanctuary Sunday School. This is something that God specifically told me to do. And one day I'll share the story about how I fought and I didn't want to do it, and where I was spiritually when I started this, and how I was ready to give up. I was tired. I was frustrated. I was tired of trying to teach people who were trying to literally overthrow me. And I just didn't want to do it anymore. And I was kind of, ready to just stop and say, well, why? Why should I be bothered? I can be saved without trying to be bothered with these people. That's where my mind was. That's where my heart was. And God spoke to me and he told me, I told you to teach and you better teach. Figure it out. Find a way to teach. And sometimes that's where our blessing comes from. That's where the fulfillment of your promise comes from. It is rooted and it is embedded in your willingness to obey God. And I can tell you, I can tell you from personal experience, when you believe God and when you obey him, he is always going to keep his promise. God cannot, will not, does not fail. I don't care what is going on in the world. I don't care what it looks like. I don't care what kind of deceptive devices that the enemy throws at you. Believe God, trust God, and know that God will always keep his promises.